Let's get right to our MS Now team. We have Nnamdi Egwuonwu, who's in Graham's home state, South Carolina, congressional reporter Michael Schnell, senior Washington reporter and The Weekend co-host, and my twin, Eugene Daniels, and MS Now contributor and senior writer at The Dispatch, David Drucker. It's good to see all of you guys this morning. But Nnamdi, I'm going to start with you because you are there in South Carolina. You have been speaking to folks. Tell us what it's like on the ground there. What is the mood?
You know, we've been here the last couple of days in the aftermath of the announcement of Senator Graham's passing. The primary emotion we're hearing is still shock. People still learning about this news even today. But once they get past the shock, it's an acknowledgement of the fact that Lindsey Graham was deeply influential in this state. Someone who, yes, served 4 terms in the Senate, but for the better part of a decade before that, represented South Carolina in the House. And even before that, worked in the state legislature. And people recognized him as someone who was quick to wield his influence more recently to support the president's agenda. But the second thing we're hearing that comes to mind when we ask, you know, what's the legacy of Lindsey Graham? What do you remember? It's his position as a war hawk. Some people praising the fact that he supported America having a strong presence in places like Iran, his sustained support for Ukraine amid its conflict with Russia. But that also, for people opposed to him, being a chief critique we're hearing, people who felt that his priorities were misplaced. I want to play for you a snapshot of some of the conversations I've had with residents here. Take a listen.
I really applaud him and acknowledge him for his efforts to help us resolve the issues that we have in the Middle East, in Iran in particular.
Lindsey Graham was a horrible senator for South Carolina. Could not do anything good, just a gigantic warmonger. And I can't wait to see what South Carolina brings when the midterms come.
What are the qualities you want to see in the person who replaces him?
Be for the people. Anything that's for the people, benefits the people, that we can actually see the benefit works for me.
Do you feel like Lindsey Graham was for the people?
Lindsey Graham was Lindsey Graham.
Now, Antonia, Republicans here in this state are going to have to contend with equally providing tribute to Graham, but also ramping up their efforts to name a successor. As you indicated, in a couple hours, Governor Henry McMaster at 4 p.m. will announce his appointment to fill the remainder of Graham's current term, with the president recommending Graham's sister Darlene for that role. But also, in just under a month, Republican Party leadership will have to organize a snap primary to find someone to replace him as the nominee to take on Democrat Annie Andrews this fall. So we are expecting certainly a couple of busy weeks here in Columbia, South Carolina.
Michael, give us the view from Capitol Hill now that there has been this power vacuum that has essentially opened up, not only because he sat on all of these key committees, was a force in his own right in the Senate, but also because he was working with the president on everything from Ukraine to the SAVE Act and all these elections-related issues ahead of the midterms.
Yeah, Antonio, there's now a huge vacuum on Capitol Hill, particularly among Republican circles, in a number of different areas without Lindsey Graham on Capitol Hill. First off, the president loses one of his key allies in the Capitol. The president often turned to Lindsey Graham to help get Democratic senators in place, Republican senators in place, if he was ever working on a priority. And it went both ways. Senator Graham would then bring back to President Trump what he was hearing in the Capitol and in the Senate circles. He was a key liaison for him, helping him get key priorities across the finish line. It's a big question now, who is going to fill that vacuum of that key connector point between the White House and Capitol Hill? Now, in terms of legislation, Republicans are now down a vote, and we know that the Senate is very closely divided. This just narrows it even more, with Republicans at 52 members and Democrats at 47. Lindsey Graham, as you mentioned, also sits on a number of these key committees. One of the biggest ones, the Budget Committee. Lindsey Graham was the chairman. There's now going to have to be a replacement there. It looks like it's going to be Senator Ron Johnson, the Republican from Wisconsin, but that is still going to have to be finalized. And then really what we could see as the first major impact of Graham's absence will be later this week. Lindsey Graham was a member of the powerful Senate Judiciary Committee, and there is that confirmation hearing of Todd Blanche to be Attorney General. That's going to take place on Wednesday. Lindsey Graham would have questioned Todd Blanche, giving an opportunity to speak there. But also, Lindsey Graham was seen as somebody who could try to get get some skeptical Republicans in line. There have been some folks who have been a little skittish about Todd Blanche, whether it be because of those settlements that were entered into with President Trump, whether it be because of that anti-weaponization fund. Lindsey Graham was seen as somebody who the president would be able to turn to get some of those skeptics in line. So in a lot of different ways, Lindsey Graham's absence is going to be recognized, particularly this week as Senate business gets underway.
Eugene, I want your take on Senator Graham's legacy here. It's a really mixed story, and some people have argued that you can basically track the GOP's transformation in recent years just by tracking the transformation of Lindsey Graham, the man, someone who at one point ran against Donald Trump and was a major critic of his, and then became a very close ally, sort of his, like, a key member of his court, someone who could explain what was going on in the president's mind to Democratic senators who would sometimes question Graham exactly about him. I want you to take a listen to something the president said earlier on Fox.
He was a great guy, and he was a friend. He would call me all the time. He would just I'd say, stop calling me Lindsey. It was amazing. Everybody loved him. He was good on the other side. If I had Democrat problems, he could solve them. Now, he had one bad moment, and that was, on the January 6th thing when he stood up. All right, now I've had it. That's it. I can't do it anymore. And then he called me like about 40 minutes later, and he said, did I really say that? I can't believe it. And he took it back. So I give him a 99 instead of a 100.
I mean, even the president there is sort of, I don't know if he means it this way, sort of painting him as a shapeshifter, actually, like within 40 minutes after January 6th. What do you think his story, his legacy is now?
I think it's going to be largely that, right? When you think about when he was part of the Three Amigos, him, John McCain, and Joe Lieberman, who was a Democrat at the time and then eventually went to being an independent, that part of his legacy is about bipartisanship. It is about a strong and strong foreign policy for this country. And then you start to see in 2015 when he runs and tries to step out on his own, and he's very critical of Donald Trump. I mean, at one point he said if the Republican Party put Donald Trump up as their nominee, they would be ruined, right? That's what he said. But after Donald Trump wins the nomination, and then after he wins, he says, basically, it's time for me to get in line. So he told everybody what he was going to do. And that's exactly what he did. So he became a staunch ally of Donald Trump's, a basically Trump whisperer for a very long time. And that continued. And when you saw him on January 6th, even the president, clearly on the president's mind, because it doesn't appear anyone brought it up to him, said that he was getting off the Trump train. I've never heard the story about after the 40-minute phone call. I think
did I even say that?
I think a lot of people have questions about that. We'll have questions about that. But then it just continued. And I think something that's really interesting is like over the last month or two, he started to tussle with the president more publicly than he usually did, talking about Iran specifically in this memorandum of understanding. So there were times in which he fought with the president
and
publicly.
Old Lindsey Graham.
And old Lindsey Graham kind of popped out.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, he was someone who had strong relationships across Capitol Hill. You can hear that from Democrats. We had Debbie Dingell on our show yesterday, and she talked about how Donald Trump attacked her online, and Lindsey Graham both publicly called for Trump to apologize and called in her and made sure she was okay. So he had that kind of part. That's part of his legacy, but also the shape-shifting is absolutely a part of it. And there are a lot of people who have a lot of questions about how we as reporters cover that, because you can hold those two things in your hand and your head at the same time, because that's what legacies are.
David, how do you hold both of those things, report on both of those things yourself? And then the other piece of, I think, what's missing from what me and Eugene were just talking about is particularly sort of Ukraine. That was one area in which Graham had, of course, in recent days or months, been quite aggressive in the president's ear, pushing for sanctions on Russia, something that, frankly, a lot of Republicans just had kind of backed away from speaking out forcefully about, which shocked a lot of Democrats, just given sort of the history of the party and the importance of pushing back on Russia. How do you see it?
Well, I think we have to understand that politicians are politicians, right? I mean, they're not priests. They're principled to a point. And what was important to Lindsey Graham, and he was very open about this, and people can like him for it or not like him for it, is that he wanted to be in the room where it happened, right? It's sort of an old Washington cliche, but he always wanted to be at the center of power. And so during the Obama administration, when the center of power involved a Democratic president and oftentimes a Democratic-controlled Senate, he wanted to be in that room. And that's why he was a part of the Gang of Eight and immigration reform legislation and all of those negotiations. Once it was clear to him where the Republican Party was going with President Trump and the Republican Party had control of both chambers of Congress, he wanted to be in that room. And so he made adjustments and he was in that room. And I think one of the reasons why he was so indispensable is because, at least from the perspective of the Reagan-era Republicans, is even though he would not push back on President Trump's more concerning issues, if you would, January 6th, his attack on American elections and American institutions, we could go on, is because for Graham, whether you liked it or not, what mattered to him was a forceful American foreign policy, the United States projecting strength across the world. And he wanted to be in the president's ear, pushing him to do that. And the way that he did that was to support a lot of the president's priorities that many people, many Republicans, clearly many Democrats found troubling. But those were very open and honest choices that he made. He didn't run from that. And I think, one of the losses here, and we'll see if anybody picks up the mantle, is that Lindsey Graham was an old school Reaganite, at least on foreign policy, who could talk to the president and encourage him not to abandon those principles. When the president wanted to let go of Ukraine and side with Russia, as he still is wont to do over and over again, Lindsey Graham could call him up and tell him this isn't a good idea, and he would listen. And so who is the Republican in the U.S. Senate or the House of Representatives or anybody else who has that kind of relationship with the president on that particular issue? I think these are the most interesting things to me as we try to figure out a post-Lindsey Graham Congress. But I think it's important, just to get back to this point, to remember that these are politicians. And so I can hold these two things in my hand, as Eugene does, as we all do, because my expectations are that they will be exactly what the job is.